Right, good morning everybody and welcome to the webinar. My name is Jason Green, I'm the Head of Workplace Research at F&TRC, and this morning we are just going to be talking you through our new Workplace Pensions Comparison tool. Just giving you all a little bit more insight on the new functionality which we've added to the system and just going through a demo process so you all get a clear understanding of how to use it. We've got quite a broad mix of people I believe on the call today. We have a mixture of advisors and indeed a couple of pension providers on the system as well. The purpose of the call obviously is just to talk you all through the system, make sure you understand how it can be fully used so you can get the best out of it and get the best outcomes. We're going to be focusing on the workplace pensions tool today. However, all of our tools do work in the same process. So even though we're focusing on the workplace module today, we do have a range of tools which are in the individual market, which we'll be happy to talk to anybody offline about if they wanted to find out some more information. Now, I believe that due to the broad mix of people that are on the call this morning, some of you will have used the system before and some of you will be new to it. So I'm going to go through from the start of the process and try and keep it quite basic. So hopefully everybody will be able to follow what I'm doing. And apologies in advance if I'm covering some old ground for those of you that have used the system in the past. So we're going to be focusing today on the Workplace Pensions Comparison tool. But before I go into the actual comparison tool itself, it probably will be worth highlighting the new ratings that we recently launched. Those of you may have seen in the press that on the 13th of July, we released some workplace pensions ratings. Hereby what we did was we went out and evaluated the pension propositions of 9 pension providers, whereby we asked them to complete a detailed online questionnaire which consisted of about 3,200 questions, and using a subset of that questions we generated a set of ratings. Now you should be seeing on your screen coming up now a high-level overview of those, which is the overall medals table. So this is available on the site free to access for any of you that have registered, and as you can see it's by clicking on the ratings tab just here. And what we're showing here on the screen is our overall medals table of positions that were awarded. So as can be seen, we benchmarked 9 pension providers in this case, which are going across the top there, which include Aegon, Aviva, Friends Life, Legal & General, Now Pensions, Royal London, Scottish Widows, Standard Life and the People's Pension. And as you can see going down the left-hand side of the table there, we looked in detail at 8 underlying areas. So the actual benchmarkings are focused on 8 key areas, which are the product offering and administration, investment and fund options, record keeping and governance, scheme setup, joiners and leavers, education, the at-retirement options, and the auto-enrollment process. Now, our actual benchmarking and studies that we conduct on workplace pensions look at a much wider set of elements. I think overall we actually look at about 35 high-level areas, which is broken down into approximately 150 underlying areas spanning over the 3,200 questions. In the case of the ratings though, after speaking to a panel of advisors and indeed a number of product providers, we narrowed it down just to zone in on the 8 areas that we're showing on the screen now, as these were deemed to be 8 of the most critical or most important features that any advisor would look at when considering a pension provider. So as can be seen on the screen, for each pension provider that we've benchmarked, we've given them an overall rating, being a gold, silver or bronze, and then we've also given them underlying ratings based on each of the 8 underlying areas that we've included. Again, each of these being achieved a gold, silver or bronze medal. What we've done to accompany this is we've also produced accompanying fact sheets for each of the pension providers which have been included. So by clicking on the overall medal or indeed the company logo, so let's take Royal London as an example, we can click through and we will also see that F&TRC have produced an individual bespoke fact sheet on each of the pension providers, which draws out some of the key features for each of the 8 areas that we've benchmarked in the ratings. So as can be seen next to each of the logos here, we've given a brief overview of the services which are available, and we've drawn out some of the strengths of the proposition or some of the nuances or some of the differences that make Royal London different to any of the other pension providers that we've included in the research, for example. We have these fact sheets for each of the companies, so they are accessible as I've just shown you by clicking on the company logo or the medal, or indeed you can go straight to the fact sheets by using the fact sheets tab on the left-hand side menu. And what this will do is it will just bring up a screen here with all 9 pension providers' logos on them, and you can just click into any provider you want to bring up their specific fact sheet. Now, all of these can then be printed as PDF documents and then used as part of your recommendation process, or indeed, shared with clients or anything else as you see fit as part of your daily processes which you do. So that was the rating side of things, which I thought I would just share with you first, as they're relatively new to the market. But what we really wanted to focus on today was looking at the comparison tools. So as I said, some of you that are on the call this morning will have already used this and generated some reports. Some of you will not have, because you've only just subscribed to the service. So I'm going to start from scratch and we'll work through the process. So in order to access the comparison, you can see here that I've clicked onto the comparison tab under the appropriate survey which I'm looking at. So we're looking here and focusing on the workplace pension survey, which includes auto-enrollment and looks at the whole pension proposition. We do, as you'll see, also have a standalone auto-enrollment comparison tool. This is just if you wanted to go and simply compare the AE proposition of a provider. The AE comparison tool is predominantly different from the workplace pensions tool in that A, it only focuses on auto-enrollment and doesn't look at the wider pension picture, but also it has a wider constituents of audience in it. By that, I mean that we don't just include pension providers in the auto-enrollment comparison tool. We also have data in there from software providers and indeed from some EBCs as well. But the new version of the tool, and the one that we're sort of most promoting at the moment, is the workplace pensions tool, because that really encompasses everything, will hopefully give you the most information. So in order to conduct a comparison, you click onto the tool and then go onto the comparison tab as I've done here, and you will see that you're firstly given 4 options. It's whether you would like to do a report from new, report from a template, record any existing reports that you've generated, or download a printable fact sheet. Now, as we're on a demo today, I'm going to do it from a template report, but as we go through the process, I will explain to you how we've got to that, and hopefully it will all become clear. So I'm going to click to do from a template, and as each of you have your own individual logins to the system, and it's all behind your own security, you have the ability to generate and build your own templates which are saved in your logins. So I'm going to recall a template which I previously built for this purpose. As you could see when I clicked on the drop down there, I had various templates under my login. You have the ability to generate these individually under your own login. And you'll see here we've got some upload and download buttons, so you're actually able to share these as well. I'll talk about that more as we go through the process. Now, what's new on the workplace pensions tool here is, as you'd possibly seen in the press releases that went out on the 20th of July, is that as well as aggregating a wealth of data about all the different pension providers, so that we're able to understand what their propositions offer and the services which they can do. We've now also built in a series of provider filters which will enable us to understand, based upon the individual employer criteria that the advisor puts in, we're able to understand which providers are actually willing to accept an AE scheme based on that employer criteria. So whether or not you've done this from a template or whether or not you're doing it a report from new, really the first step that you do as your advisor is input some employer details, i.e. the client you're dealing with. So I've got a test employer set up here, and as you can see by clicking on there, it's asking me to fill in some information, which is simply the employer name or your client name, and then we've got 5 key questions here. So the first question is we're asking you to input is the size of the workforce that you're dealing with. So you can see here we've got a number of drop downs ranging from 1 up to 60 plus members. For this instance, I'm going to set the boundaries quite broad and say that we've got, currently we're talking to an employer that's got between 45 and 59 employees. We're then asked to confirm what you expect the monthly contributions to be per member. Again, we have a series of banded drop downs here, and I'm again going to set these really high and say we're expecting a minimum of £500 per member per month. We're then asked when the employer is staging, And let's go for something high and say in at least 12 months' time. The fourth question is relating to the staff turnover or how transient the workforce is. And in this instance, let's just say they have a very low staff turnover of less than 10%. And then we're asking, does the employer have more than one payrolls or not? And let's just say no here. Let's say they're operating a single payroll. So what we've done here is by using those 5 questions, we've actually gone through a bit of a scheme acceptance criteria. Now, we generated these 5 questions and chose these 5 hurdles based upon advisor consultants' feedback. This is how it sits at the moment, but we probably will add to this in the future, and this may well change, but as a starting position, we've sort of set it on 5 for now. So what you've done here is you've effectively now put in an employer profile for us, so we know the size of the scheme and the basic credentials about it. Having done that, we then actually start to go in and choose the elements that we want to include in our benchmarking and our comparison reports. So you can see here, we've brought up 2 columns, operational and product features. Operational being much larger here than the product features. And each of these are the underlying elements that we've actually benchmarked in the survey. So each of these is an area that's been covered, and each of these high-level areas will have a number of subsections or sort of detailed areas that sit beneath them. By using your mouse and hovering over any of these, it will bring up a brief tooltip which explains what sits beneath it. So for example here, by hovering over investment of funds options, it tells us that this section is looking at the underlying investment of fund options available within the chosen product, and looking at default investments, etc. And it tells us that within here, we can further drill down and look at individual layers on investment of fund options, fund fact sheets, and default investments. Likewise, if we took the record keeping and governance section here, again, it gives us a brief explanation of what we mean by that, and then tells us that this consists of 2 underlying areas that are subdivided into record keeping and governance. Now, I said at the start of the process that I was going to run this from a template. So as you'll be able to see, I've got a number of these selection criteria already pre-ticked. If you were doing this as a report from new, you'd still do the same process as we did at the start, whereby we'd input the employer profile, but when it comes to this selection screen, this would be left blank for you to choose the areas that you want to include. Now, the way the system works is it allows you to include up to 10 of these high-level areas in any comparison report that you run. So because this is a template, as I said, I've got my selection here pre-ticked for me. Having chosen the areas that you want to include in your benchmarking, continue at the bottom here to weight your priorities, and the system will invite you to go through and add a percentage to each of those areas based on how important you believe they are. Again, as you can see, this has been pre-populated for me because I'm working from a template. If you were doing this from scratch or from a new report, having chosen your up to 10 areas you want to include, when it comes to this page, you would then key in the percentages down the right-hand side there yourselves. So obviously the idea here is that it's 100% in total, and you divide that weighting between the up to the 10 areas you've selected based on how important you think or believe each of these elements are going to be in the overlying decision that you're going to make in relation to selecting a provider. To support each of these, there's also a notes button. So it's really important to bear in mind, I think, that what you get at the output of this process is an employer bespoke Word document which contains a series of graphical information and analysis based upon the selection criteria you've decided to benchmark, and it will then give you an output report detailing which providers the system or F&TRC believe best suit your needs, and therefore you may wish to approach in relation to placing the scheme with. All the notes and all the commentary which you added at this stage form part of that output report. So the more detail you put in by recording here, for example, any commentary, rationale or reason as to why you and the client have decided that the AE functionality and process in this instance is weighted 20% and the highest. If you record all of that, it does form part of the bespoke Word report at the end. So you've got something there that really backs up the rationale, which can either be given to the client or used as part of a suitability letter or addendum. So having gone through and allocated your weightings and indeed then adding any supporting notes that you wish to do, the system will then go through and say which providers would we like to include in our search. So as you can see here at the moment, we've currently got 8 providers in the live system, which is Aegon, Aviva, Friends Life, Legal & General, Now Pensions, Royal London, Standard Life and the People's Pension. Question that we normally get asked at this point is there seems to be 2 big names which are obviously missing, which are Nest and Scottish Widows. We are in dialogue with both organisations in order to get their data in the system. We do not charge any provider to be represented in the tool, but obviously in order for them to be represented in Quality Analyser, the providers need to complete all the underlying data. Now, I'd already referenced that as approximately 3,200 questions, so it's quite an undertaking for the providers to do, and obviously takes a lot of resource and commitment on their part. Scottish Widows, we're in dialogue with, and we're hopeful that they will be represented in the system very shortly. In terms of Nest, we have extended an invite to them, and we're hoping to improve, to continue that dialogue in the future. And hopefully, they may well decide to do that, but we do not know that at the moment. So what you're basically being invited to do here is say, which providers do I want to include in my search? Now, as a sort of a limit here, the system requires that you include at least a minimum of 3 providers per search that you do. But for this instance, I'm just going to do a select all and say we want to include all the providers and do a sort of a whole of market based on the 8 providers data that we currently hold. So having chosen that, the system will then just give me as the user a brief playback. So donut diagram here, which just plays back the areas that I've chosen as high-level criteria and the weightings that I've applied, along with the list of providers which I want to include in my benchmarking. Both of these have a refine button, so if you wish to go back and amend your weightings or indeed remove or add a provider, you can do so. But having done that, based upon that high-level initial data, the system will produce the initial report for us. And what we're showing on the screen here now is on the pie chart on the left-hand side, it's playing back to us the priorities that I've chosen as the user and how I've weighted them. The small bar chart on the right-hand side here is saying for each of these priorities that I've selected, how the providers have scored relative to the underlying benchmark which have been set by F&TRC. And then the main bar graph on the bottom here is playing back to us based upon what I've chosen as the user up in this pie chart on the left. The system has gone away, analysed the results provided by the providers, and come back here with a graph of best match or best suited providers based upon my needs or my criteria that I've input here. So this has gone away and analysed the questions that relate to each of the sections we've chosen, and depending on how the providers have answered those, and it's brought back for us the data with which we've put into the graphical analysis, which plays back here in descending order which provider might be most suitable for you. Now, you'll recall at the start of the process, what we did here was we set that employer profile where I actually set it quite high, saying there was, I think, over 50 members all paying in over £500 a month, not staging for 12 months with a very low staff turnover and only operating 1 payroll. So based on that criteria, it's actually saying that all 8 providers in the system are willing to accept the scheme. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump back slightly and go back to that first page where we input the employer credentials and just then give you a demonstration of, depending on how you set that, the outcomes can change, and this is the new functionality that we've added. So if I was to now to say we're actually looking at a much smaller scheme of 15 to 24 members that are only actually paying in £50 to £99 per month, they're staging in 1 to 3 months, they have a medium staff turnover, and they are operating more than 1 payroll. So we can see we've really shifted up the employer sort of profile here. This will then give us a different outcome depending on which providers are willing to accept the scheme. So I'm doing this on exactly the same template as I did before. So my high-level selections are chosen, and indeed my weightings have been applied for me. But this time, when I get through to choosing the providers, as like before, I will say I want to include all 8 providers, but we will see that the outcome on the graph on the initial report is different. So what we will see here, for example, is it's now saying that we've got used exactly the same data, but based on the employer credentials that we input, it's now saying that this Aegon will not accept your scheme for 2 of the following reasons. They will not accept an employer which operates more than one payroll, and they will not accept a scheme with contributions of less than £150 per member per month. So now obviously we've only got 7 providers showing in our output here. Now every time we change these employer credentials, depending on how each of the underlying providers have answered the data, this can shift. So if I just go back and show us one more example on this, again I'm going to choose exactly the same template as I had before. So my search credentials aren't different, but this time when I go to the employer profile, let's make this a bit more dramatic here, saying that actually the client's going to be staging in less than 1 month, and they're only expecting contributions to be between £25 and £49 per month. And then if we follow the process back through and get to that initial report, I think we're seeing in this instance that we actually have a few more providers which won't be showing, and it gives us the rationale for it. So now we can see our search criteria has actually been whittled down to only 4 providers, being Standard Life, Aviva, People's Pension and Nest. And again, we have an explanation table here saying the reasons why. So Aegon have been excluded because they will not accept an employer with more than 1 payroll, and they require contributions of a minimum of £150 per member per month. And they also said they will not accept a scheme which is less than 1 month from its staging. Likewise, Friends Life and Legal in General also will not accept an employer who is less than 1 month from their staging date. And Royal London have been excluded on this instance because A, they require contributions of at least £83 per member per month. I actually think the Royal London stance is £1,000 per annum. And again, they've also said they require at least 1 month from the staging date. So I went through that quite quickly, but I hope you've got the gist of it there, that depending on how you set the employer profile, it will limit what data comes through from certain providers based on the scheme acceptance terms that they've told us and they've put into the system. I think it's quite important if we stress here, F&TRC do not put any data into Quality Analyser. All the data is input directly by the providers themselves, and we have no say on that. So we obviously validate it and we do a series of checks with them to ensure it's correct, but in terms of putting responses in, that onus is solely on the provider, and we ensure that they do that. So I'm going to continue the process now, because even though I've just done a couple of examples here, I wanted to show you the difference it can make by, what employer criteria we select, which I think becomes particularly prevalent now as we're getting down to the smaller end of the SME market. But the system then goes through and takes us on to the next stage. So having reached this first of all initial stage, which at the moment is only giving us some graphical analysis based upon the high level weightings that we've input of the areas that we've said are important, the system will then invite you to go through and start building up some further detailed analysis, and we do that by clicking on the purple button at the bottom here. Here we're taken into the next stage of the system where we start to build up a second layer of detail. So having already selected our high-level areas and already applied the weightings to them, we're now being asked to go and subdivide the underlying weightings. So if we take this first section here as an example, product offering and administration, in this case study we've given it an overall weighting of 7.5% from the overall 100%, but then the product offering and admin section then consists of 4 underlying areas, whereby we're looking at cash accounts, product administration, product offering, and product options and contributions. Again, because this is a template, my weightings here have been input for me, and as you can see, we've allocated our 100% just between 4 of these. And if you're the user going through, obviously, you'd input these details as you see fit. As like the first stage of the process, there's a separate notes section again. So you could be going through and recording the client conversations, giving the rationale and the justification as to why you've selected these areas and why you've entered them as you have done so. And you'll then follow that process through for each of the up to 10 areas that you've input into the system. Now, as you'll see on here, there may well be 3, there may well be 10 underlying areas. You do not have to give a weighting to everything as long as the grand total adds up to 100. So if you wish to do so, you can add 100% just to one subsection and leave the rest blank, or as you can see in the case of what I've done here, subdivided in most of them. So we'll follow that process through. Obviously, as the advisor, this would be done with a lot of care and consideration. This is the template, so it's pre-selected, so I just sort of scroll down through here. And once we've gone through that, added in any commentary as we go through, we then go to our sort of second playback screen, whereby, as like before, we're given a brief overview of the high-level areas that we've chosen as important and how we've weighted them. And we then go through and we look at how we've then subdivided our underlying weightings on the second part of the process. As like before, these all have a refine button, so if you want to go back and tweak or amend anything, you can do so. And then we get one last look at the list of providers that we can include in our search as well. Again, with a refine button to go and add or remove anybody if you wish to do so. You're given two more final options here before we get to the final output report. You are able to give your report a name or indeed a description. We added these buttons in because even though the report will already be bespoke with your employer name, because we set that in the employer profile at the very start of the process, feedback from advisors that have been using the tool have said, as an advisor, you may well go into an employer firm and you may sit and use, you may do one comparison report based upon the credentials and the criteria set by the HR manager, for example. And if you ran the same process with the FD, the finance director, or another senior member within the organisation, they are likely to have different criteria and weight them differently. So you're able to run several reports based on one organisation here, just obviously naming them and giving them separate descriptions. So it's allowing you to build up a real holistic picture of what those organisational needs are, so you're able to hopefully then suggest to them the most suitable supplier in order to make them AE compliant. The last thing we've got here is would you wish to save your selections as a template? And I've kept on referencing all the way through this process that my criteria were pre-selected and my weightings were predefined. That was because I was working from a template. If we had gone through this process from scratch and chosen our selection and weighted it as we gone by, it's at this point where you could then save that as your own template. So by ticking the box there and giving it a name, you're able to save your own criteria as a template under your own login. And as I referenced at the start of the process, those templates can then be downloaded as XML files and emailed and shared with any of your colleagues within your firm. So we're getting a lot of feedback that the way this is being particularly used in possibly some larger organisations is that compliance or head office are generating a series of templates for different employer or client groups, and they're then issuing them out to all the different users within their organisation as a starting block. So it means that all advisors within the same organisation are starting on the same template. Now, obviously, I appreciate that might be tweaked or changed accordingly depending on each individual employer needs, but at least all the advisors are starting from the same sort of house view in that respect. So we've finalised all the sections now. We've input all our data, so we're ready to go through and generate our final report. So we click on the Generate Detailed Report at the bottom. The system will now bring us up the final report. Now, very similar to the initial report, it will play back here in the pie chart on the left, the high-level areas that you've chosen as the user and how you've weighted them as important, how each of the areas you've chosen has scored relative to the underlying F&TRC benchmark, and then it gives us that overall graph of best match or best fit provider based upon what you've decided to benchmark. Now, obviously, we ran several versions of this, and we're on the sort of skimmed down version now, where it's only showing four providers. On the initial report, it already gave us the table detailing why those providers were excluded. But again, that's just going to recap there for us that this report is excluding the following providers, and the rationale obviously has already been given to you. Now, not only does this final report give us that overall picture of sort of best match provider or most suitable provider based on the data inputs, it then goes through and produces the same sort of graphical information for each of the underlying areas you've chosen. So just because one provider is best overall, obviously it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best provider at each of the underlying areas. So as you can see as we scroll down through these, the order in these is changing each time. And then we're bringing up different providers in different positions. So we're hopefully providing you with some really detailed analysis, so you're really able to understand what providers are offering, and the services which they're producing, etc. Now, any notes that you've added will come in here as well. So I think we added some as we went through, but you also have the ability to add any additional notes as you go through the process, if you want to add anything else in. And then we've got here, hopefully, a full analysis, which will enable you to make a really strong recommendation on. Now, this is the on-screen version, but what we really recommend is you go through to the Word version of the report, which I think adds most value. There are two options for this. The first one is you can do a summary report. So I'm going to click on that button now, and downloaded almost instantaneously there is we've got a Word report for us, which is a 2-page high-level summary document. And what this simply does is on the first page here, it just plays back the areas that you've chosen with a description of what they are and how you've weighted them. And on the back of that page, it just gives us that overall comparison graph of best match provider. So this is obviously some very high-level analysis that you may in fact even want to do before you go and see the client, based upon information you already know. So you can be demonstrating that you've really given them some consideration, already thought about what providers might be most suitable for them. But what we really recommend is that people go through and use the detailed Word report. So by clicking on the detailed Word report button here, what this is saying to us is it's going to bring up all the graphical information that we've seen on the screen, so all the graphs, but this pop-up box is saying, would we also like to include the data tables showing the responses from the top 5 scoring providers? So what this is saying is, for each of the areas that we've chosen to include in our benchmark, and for each of the areas that we've got graphical information, the Word report is also going to bring through the underlying questions that we've asked in that area, and then detail to us how the top 5 providers have responded to those questions. So you're going to get a real set of detailed analysis here, really understanding the questions that have been used to determine how the graphical inputs have been produced, but then secondly, how each of the providers have answered to those. So it really sort of allows you to get under the bonnet and really drill into the detail of different propositions out there. So if I click yes to that, it's now going to start generating the report for me. Now, these reports take approximately 1 to 3 minutes, depending on how big and how many areas that you've chosen. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring up one that I've already pre-generated. So what you'll get on the output here is Word report for you. Here I've said here it's a sample report, but in here where I've just highlighted, this will actually bring through your employer's name for you. So it's bespoke to the individual employer. Then it also brings through who's prepared it and the date they prepared it on. So very similar to the initial report and what we've seen on screen, just gives us an index page telling us the areas that we've chosen and a brief description of what we mean by those, a very brief explanation of how to use the report, and then very similar to the on-screen version that we were looking at, it gives us the pie chart on the left of the high-level areas that you've chosen and how you've selected them, compared to how they've scored relative to the underlying F&TRC benchmark. And then it gives us that overall graph of best match comparison or sort of best provider there. And then, as like we saw on screen, it goes through and looks at each of the underlying areas as well, again, giving us that detailed analysis. Now, this is the report with where we've set it with no restrictions. If I bring up the other version here, we see that as like we saw on the on-screen version I was running, it's removed providers, and exactly like we saw on the screen, we've also into the report brought through the table giving us the reason or the rationale as to why certain providers have been removed. And then it continues in exactly the same manner to go and look at all the underlying graphical information. Now, to support that, I reference that it also brings through the questions. So at the back of all the graphs, unlike what you'd see on the on-screen report, we also have the appendices here of data tables. So what this is doing, as I said before, is bringing through for each of the areas that we've chosen to include, it's bringing through all the underlying questions which have been asked and how each of the underlying providers have then scored them. So by default, this brings through the answers for the top 5 scoring organizations. Obviously, in this example, it's only got 4 because due to the restrictions that we put in place, the system told us that only 4 providers were willing to accept the scheme. If you were doing it on a larger basis, it will bring through the top scoring 5 providers and then give you an option to add in a 6th provider from the remaining list of your choice if there was somewhere specifically that you wanted to include in your benchmarking. So what we're really hoping is here you've got a bespoke Word report which has been employer produced with your employer's or client's name on the front, a full analysis looking at a workplace pension, understanding the criteria which you believe are important to that particular employer, giving you a really detailed set of analysis and benchmarking based on how well they achieve, backed up by all the underlying questions here, of course supported by any of the notes and commentary which you've then added in as you've gone through. So we've gone through that relatively quickly, but I hope that sort of gives you an overview of how the system works. As I said, we do have also a standalone auto-enrollment tool, and there actually is a standalone GSIP as well at the moment. Both of these work in exactly the same process, so that the structure of the way that QA works is the same by choosing your criteria and weighting them, and the output reports all look, they're all in the same sort of format. As I said, we do have this in other areas as well. So if you do individual protection business, as you can see here by clicking on the protection tab, we've got a wealth of protection tools here looking at all different elements. We will have savings and investments coming very shortly, and we also have software tools which look at financial planning and risk portfolio and client management systems, etc. And also new to this as well, we also have the due diligence section. So some of you may have seen in the press this week, we had some coverage that went out saying we are actually now gathering information around due diligence as well, which can be accessed here. So we've had a number of questions come through, so I'm just going to see if I can just scroll through these now and answer these. So as we go through. So we had another question regarding about other providers being added to the system, particularly Nest. So I think I covered that earlier. Nest have been invited. Obviously, Nest have a public service obligation in place whereby they are bound to take any scheme. Historically, their outlook on this has been that, as they've got the POS in place, they don't necessarily need to be benchmarked against other providers. We've had dialogue with Nest for a number of years now, and we will continue to do so. And hopefully, I can't guarantee it, but possibly in the future they will be in the system. We would welcome them, but obviously we can't force them to be so on there. We've had another question regarding, does the scheme show which providers charge employer fees? It doesn't actually show that at the moment. That is an area that we're actually just looking to improve. So we do at the moment have a section under auto enrollment which looks at scheme charges and member charges. We will be building into that very shortly some questions around about whether or not there's an employer charge which is put in place or not. Another question is this an interactive service with the employer? At the moment, this is not employer facing. This is solely meant for advisors. So obviously, as you'll be aware, because you've all registered, this is a free service. We do not charge anything for this. So any member of the Personal Finance Society gets access free of charge. However, we are being slightly relaxed about that, and we are indeed now letting a number of accountants also have access to it. We have been asked many times whether or not we will do an employer-facing version of this. At the moment, we still haven't made a decision on that. We can see pros and cons against it. We've certainly got nothing in the immediate pipeline. That may well change, but at the moment, it's an advisor-facing tool. In terms of advisors using it, advisors are more than welcome to use it if they wish in front of their clients. We get some advisors saying that they do that, and it's fantastic because this system works. It works great actually on an iPad. I think a lot better than a PC actually. I think some of the rendering looks a lot nicer and it's a bit easier to use. Some advisors are saying they like to use it in front of their clients. Other advisors are saying they like to capture the information with the employer at a meeting and then come and put the data into the system afterwards. Actually, that's what this last button here is, which I never showed you. If I go back into the comparison report, obviously report from new I've explained, report from a template I've explained, recalling existing report is pretty self-explanatory, but downloaded printable fact sheet, what this does is actually brings up for us here a document that can be used offline. So it's basically brought through the pages that you would select on the system where you'd allocate your weightings and so on, but on a paper form document. So if any advisors were speaking to clients offline and wanted to capture information, they can almost use this as a prompt sheet, which they can then go back and key into the system when back in the office, when not in front of the client. There's a few more questions. We've had a question saying, can the branding on the reports be changed to their own business name? Yeah, indeed. So I've obviously been showing you the F&TRC version today, which is the free version, the vanilla version, as we generally refer to it. We do white labeled bespoke versions of this as well. So, you know, a very large example of that is we have a very large employee benefits firm that have their own white labeled version of the tool, which has then not only been white labeled so it's all branded as them, they've then taken it you know, many steps further, and they've actually got their own scoring model and their own questions included into that as well. But yeah, we certainly are able to do white labeled versions for individual employer firms if they didn't want it as F&TRC, and if anyone wants to speak to me about that offline, then contact me directly and I can talk more about that. Couple more questions here as we've still got a bit of time left. How do we know whether the company accepts the payroll used? That's a really good question, and we do actually have a payroll integration section in here at the moment, whereby we identify, I think at the moment it's about 12 of the top payroll providers, and the pension providers will tell us whether or not they can integrate with them. We are also looking, as like the charges section, that is on our top of our list to go and add some more detail into. But we do cover it at the moment within the workplace pension survey. There is a section called auto-enrollment process and functionality, and within the AE section there is a payroll integration section, and in there you'll be able to clearly see which providers are integrating with which payroll for the ones we've got listed. We are having actually a bit of an internal debate at the moment as to whether or not at the start of the process where we select the provider filters and the key acceptance questions, whether or not one of those should relate to payroll. We're having open discussions about that, and we're talking to advisors and getting feedback as to whether that's appropriate or not. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'll be happy to pick it up with them offline. I think we've got 2 more questions coming through. Does the system link through to the provider for setup? Really good question. It's something we are currently in dialogue about at the moment. So when we first showed this new upgrade of the system to a group of advisors, the first question they said was, oh great, so when we're at this point and we've got the graph here saying which providers are best, can we click on the graph and it will take us straight through to the pension provider's website so we can commence setup? That is something we're in conversations with at the moment. So I guess that's a kind of watch this space for the time being. But it's certainly on our radar, and certainly something, yeah, we would like to see happen in the future if possible. And the final question is how often the provider acceptance terms are updated. So as I referenced at the start of the process, all the data held within the database for Quality Analyser is input via the providers. We do not, F&TRC, do not put any data in ourselves. So the providers have a separate system to this, which is a back office SQL Server database, whereby we've got all the questions which they go in and answer. That system is permanently open 24/7. So as and when a provider changes their proposition or indeed makes upgrades to their system or introduces new functionality, they're able to go into the back office system and update their survey responses accordingly, and that feeds through live into Quality Analyser, which I've been showing you today as the advisor-facing version. Now, obviously, we have built very strong work relations with all the providers in the system, and they are now very much adopting the process whereby they know that as circumstances change their ends, they go through and they change that in our system so it's reflected through to the advisors. So we encourage it as much as possible. So obviously we cannot ensure that if a provider makes a change, they will update it in our system immediately, but we are encouraging that as much as possible, and the provider community are working with us also, and they are telling us that's what they're doing. So we're hoping that the data in the system is really reflective and as accurate as it can be. Right, I think that covers off all the questions. So we're going to end it now. If anybody has anything they want to come back to me on, then by all means drop me an email. It's jason.green, just jason.green, green, @ftrc.co.uk. Or feel free to give me a call on my direct number here in the office, which is 0203 713 4563. So I hope that helped a little bit and has given you a bit more of a feel for what the system can do. As I said, if anyone's got any more specific questions or wants to go anything in detail, contact me directly and I'll be happy to help. Many thanks. Bye.